앨런러셀. I think she said that in the introduction. I want to focus mainly on risk rather than on compliance. And I'll talk about the issues we see round about risk. And these are issues that are coming round about the world in general. So the first area is that of regulation. We see lots of new rules, lots of new areas being regulated. If you look at Basel II, for example, it covered mainly areas of credit risk and operational risk and a bit of market risk, different capital requirements, even for the areas that were regulated before. And there are some new areas that are being covered. For example, the big area of liquidity is now covered by regulation that wasn't before. There are some areas around about counterparty dealing in the trading book that are covered as well now too. So there's an expansion of the footprint of regulation. The other footprint that's changing is around about the geographical spread. For a long time, Basel II, for example, was mainly a European and Asian phenomenon. The United States didn't really have to do much around about that. However, now we see that they are requiring a much wider range of banks to go into Basel III, and that's going to drive them towards a more regulated environment and an IT environment that's capable of supporting regulation. The other challenge that many banks are facing, and this is certainly an issue in the European Union, is that there are multiple regulators looking at approximately the same thing. So we've always had, or for quite a while, we've had IFRS and Basel II, but now we see, for example, country legislation and European level legislation that are similar but not quite the same. And so they're faced with having multiple regulatory regimes that they need to handle. That we see is that of systems renewal. This is to some extent driven by regulatory requirements, but it's also driven by business requirements. Today, an awful lot of banks have what we call silo-based systems. They'll have one system that they look after, for example, retail credit, and a completely different system that's looking after commercial credit. They may even have multiple retail credit systems if they've been through a lot of merger and acquisition activity. And the other thing we're seeing, often because of regulatory pressure, is divestiture, banks having to split off and sell parts of their business because the EU regulations require them to do that. And that's resulting in a lot of renewal of the systems. One of the things that they're also trying to address is that their data is often not at all organized. They have the same data in 2 or 3 different formats. They have data gaps. They can't reconcile the data across between the different systems. And so there's a lot of activity and interest going on in renewing those systems in order to be able to better address the requirements of the regulator and just to manage the bank in general. And the last major topic we see as a concern is that of performance. We see a requirement to reduce the time to get results out of the system, so no longer just doing things at the end of the quarter or the end of the month. They want to have more immediate results coming out, and that means reducing the run times. It also means, in many cases, relaxing a constraint that they've had so far. In many cases, the methodologies they've used have been designed to counter or get by constraints in the systems that they have. With the availability of high-performance systems, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, they're able to extend the methodologies they use to do a wider range of things that they've always wanted to do, but were prevented from because of technology constraints they had. The buzzword that we hear a lot at the moment is intraday. In certain markets, particularly in the trading side, they want to see what's going on as the day progresses rather than always just looking back at what happened yesterday or the day before. And that also places quite a lot of strain on the infrastructure, and the whole idea of infrastructure renewal to meet regulation and performance requirements is what we see going on very, very frequently. Good, and I'll talk now about, so these issues here are general issues that are faced across the industry. Here are some of the things that SAS has got or is working on that help us address or help our customers address these issues. So if we look at the regulation area, one thing, as I mentioned, is that there are lots of new areas of regulation, lots of new topics coming up. one of the things that we focus on is building a common application suite that addresses all the different areas that they need to look into across, for example, Basel III. That means they don't need to go and buy another application from another party, a third party, to deal with that. So the second area that's interesting, and this is also on the same theme of having commonality across the wide range of regulation, is to have common risk calculation engine across that can handle different kinds of calculations required for the regulations. And the second topic that's interesting there is this expansion in regulation has also resulted in an expansion of the numbers of models that they have to manage. And so what you are seeing a lot is people looking towards building what's called a model factory. In other words, a very organized, structured approach to not just building, but managing the whole model life cycle. And the regulator actually requires that they do this, but they're becoming more and more organized in looking after the modeling. There are lots of modeling used in risk management. I mean, one that you'll all be familiar with is the idea of the credit score, where somebody applies for credit and we use a model to decide how much credit, what we're going to charge them. But there are many, many other models used in risk management, and the modeling part is one of the core parts to it. So for example, you would have a model of how your funding works, how your liquidity would work, and you need to manage all those models. Now, there's a second part to that, which comes up here, is that the data that you use to drive those models is becoming more and more comprehensive. And so our data model, which is focused on analytics, so it looks at risk type topics in a way that supports the methodologies that's used. That's a second key part of what's going on here. Okay, before I move on, I'll just come back up here to this point which I missed. One of the things that we're seeing a lot is that the regulation and the expansion in regulation is causing an increased participation of the finance groups in the companies in addressing risk issues. In the past, the two groups, risk and finance, were somewhat separate, but they're being pushed together now, and the risk measures are being used for financial reporting, and the finance processes are being used to help in risk management. So that's something that we also address with some of our offerings around, for example, capital planning. It's a common task that involves both. And then we come to the last topic, which is that of performance. Now, it's clear that across the IT world, topics such as in-memory and massively parallel processing are coming along. They're absolutely common, they're everywhere. And all the vendors are using them for their own purposes. If you look, SAP, for example, has their HANA initiative, which uses in-memory and parallelization to try and replace the requirement for a general relational database. They've put their database in memory. Oracle's also put its database in memory. So all the suppliers are really trying to do things with these techniques here. The difference about SAS is we're an analytics company, and one of the things that we use our analytics for is to focus on risk. And so as part of our high performance analytics initiative, we're seeing the risk modeling and risk calculation activities being moved into exploit, in-memory and massively parallel computing. And this is big analytics. We have big data, and risk is a big creator of big data. But to handle that properly, you also need big analytics. And that's what our HP risk offering is focused on. Now, there are plenty places in banking risk where this kind of high performance is required. One example is in calculation of liquidity, where you may have millions, tens of millions of cash flows that you need to be able to generate. You have also activities like stress testing that require an enormous amount of compute power to run all the scenarios that are needed to conduct the multiple stress tests that banks are now asked to do. So there are quite a number of business drivers that require us to be able to exploit new technology to do good things in the risk world.